this whole room of police, but you can't tell they're police because they don't have uniforms. And they're asking me all these questions and how long are you here? Why are you here? And then I got a little suspicious because one of the guys, he goes, well, are you working for a magazine? And the only thing I could think of was they actually looked up my name on the internet and saw that I was a photographer and wondered if I had some ulterior motive. So that kind of got me worried. They interviewed me in the lobby. Then they came to the restaurant I was eating at and interviewed me. And then the chief of police came back to the hotel and interviewed me. And he said, oh, we're going to put 2 police in the room next to you overnight. And then in the morning, we're going to follow you. Well, I had no idea what was going on. And, I'm sitting there and I looked up on Google the most likely countries in the world for an American to be kidnapped. And of course, Bangladesh made the top 25. So that didn't make me feel any better.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on 2 wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm very excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Scott Sharick. After spending 30 years working in healthcare, Scott made the decision in 2015 to become what he calls financially poor and experientially rich. He then moved to Cambodia, but just a year later would suffer from a stroke. Now, thankfully, Scott made a full recovery, but this was the jolt he needed to get his health back in order. And so he turned to the bicycle to do this. In fact, it was halfway through his first short ride where Scott knew he would be embarking on a bicycle adventure which would see him cycle around the world. He spent 2 years planning out this journey before finally setting off in 2018. Since then, he has cycled over 65,000 kilometres through Southeast Asia, Australia and the US, and has had a global pandemic and a broken bike see him have to put the tour on pause a couple of times. I'm now speaking to Scott while he's in the US on what he calls leg number 2 of this journey, and one which will see him visit all 51 national parks contained within the lower 48 states. I absolutely cannot wait to dig into this adventure with Scott and find out more about the experiences he has built up so far on this journey. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hello, Bella. It's nice to finally get to talk to you.
I've had the benefit of looking forward to speaking with you for so long now, Scott, so I'm probably more excited than normal. But before we get into all the questions I have, the first one, which I start my show with, and I ask this of all my guests, is, Scott, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
I actually don't. That's been quite a few years now, but I do remember a specific story that happened maybe when I was 10 years old with my bike. I always seemed to be into bikes and I always liked biking. When I was 10 years old, I decided there was probably something wrong with my bike. So I went to the library to get a book, How to Fix Your Bike. And so I had to ride. It's only a mile from where I was growing up to the library. And I rode my bike, put it outside, went in, searched, got the bike book that I wanted, came back out, no bicycle.
Oh, no.
So here I was with a book on how to fix my bike, but my bike just got stolen. And that was the first bike that I've ever had stolen. But
did you ever get it back? Did they find it?
No. Yeah, that was way back, like 1970 probably. And I didn't lock it up. I mean, didn't think to lock it up. Days were different back then. So I was left without a bike for a little while.
Without a bike, but with all the knowledge in your hand of how to fix it.
Yeah,
if you bought a broken bike.
Exactly.
Did you ever read the book?
I did. I'm sure it helped me do something in the future. And yeah, that was the beginning of trying to learn more about how to fix a bike, even though I don't know that much even to this day. But with YouTube, I can kind of follow through and get some things done. But I always rely on the bike shops.
There's a certain element when you embark on a world tour like you have, Scott, where you sort of have to have faith that whatever bike problem you're going to have, you're just going to have it within yourself to solve that problem as you go. And I often think the power of YouTube tutorials and being able to visually see and hear if you've got service has been so helpful to so many adventurers out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you have had a broken bike during this trip, actually, haven't you?
Yeah, I've had a few things happen. This is my third bike that I've had. It's a Surly Bridge Club that I have now.
Another Surly.
Yeah, three long haul trucker, the Troll, and then they stopped making the Trolls, so now I have the Bridge Club, which I like a lot.
Because they're different models, and I know the long haul trucker and I know the Troll. So the Bridge Club, did it replace the Troll?
I don't know if it replaced it, but it's very similar. It has more of the mountain bike configuration, which I like that feel more than the classic touring bike, which seems a little bit, I don't want to say stiff, but it just seems it's a different kind of riding that I prefer more of a mountain bike.
I've had the benefit of sort of trolling through your photos and your YouTube videos and seeing where you have ridden, especially through Southeast Asia. I sort of think that a lot of, although I don't think you would have had this bike then, but a lot of the roads that you were riding there, I could see a more mountain bikey setup would have just been ideal.
Yeah, exactly. The roads in Southeast Asia, I'm in the U.S. now, and it's like, oh, when I look at the road, I go, oh, I want to get down and pet it. It's so nice and smooth.
I could imagine. I've spoken to some guests who physically have kissed the road when they've gotten off the most corrugated, roughest surface and then gotten back onto the smooth asphalt. But often the adventures lie on the road less travelled, and I'm sure that you've taken a few of those so far. I mentioned in my introduction 65,000 kilometres plus, over 40,000 miles. There's so many stories contained within that, really, isn't it?
Yeah, every day you wake up and you ride, and it's like, what's going to happen today? Is it good? Is it bad? The only thing I know is it's unknown, and that's part of the excitement for me. A lot of people like a little structure, and I mean, I would like things to work out every day, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but that to me is part of the joy of being out on the road all the time, something new.
When you plan a trip that's so big, you can't plan everything. There is so much new. There is so much unknown there. I guess, though, Scott, I mentioned the catalyst for taking this trip was when you suffered your stroke, but you had actually undertaken a couple of bicycle tours, bike adventures before, but long before, hadn't you? I think your first trip was in the 90s?
Yeah, 1990, I crossed the country, United States, from Rochester, where I lived, to Seattle. And I did that. Well, I say I did it to raise money for the children's hospital I worked at, but actually I thought that was a good way to get the summer off, to say, hey, I'll make some money for you if you give me the summer off. And it worked. And so that was 1990. Then in 2003, I went down the East Coast from Rochester to Disney World, also to raise money for the children's hospital. So I always had it in me to go far on a bike.
I mean, they're huge journeys. Interestingly enough, I was just thinking there, it's just occurred to me, I've had the benefit of speaking to guests who've done that cross-country, east to west or west to east, and I've had people go north to south or south to north, but always generally on the Pacific coast. I'm actually thinking, surely it can't be the case. You're potentially the first guest I've spoken to who I've interviewed about going down the east coast there.
I don't know what made me think of that. I think it was just kind of the time frame and how much I kind of figured out how much time I had. I was actually leaving my job and I was going to move to Hawaii, or at least I thought I was going to move to Hawaii, but I didn't actually have a job until I crossed the border to Florida. Actually, that morning they called and offered me the job. So I left my other job without a job in place to replace it and went on that journey. And I wanted it to be I think it was about 25 days. So I thought maybe about a month would be a good time frame. And I thought, I'll go to Disney World. Just sounds like a good place to go.
Did you actually go to Disney World when you got there?
Yeah, my last night was right in the property in Disney World. And I remember how sad that last day was, because I get done with this long journey and I pull into this big hotel in Disney World and not one person cares about me and what I did. It's just me. And it's not that I expect fanfare and, people cheering and everything, but it's kind of not a low point, but it's kind of okay, I'm done. Now what do I do?
Yeah, and you sort of fall back into just being, especially if you're away from the bike, you're just a normal person again? Because it's something that struck me, Scott, when I've looked at some of the videos you've posted up of your trips through countries in Southeast Asia and Asia, and, India or somewhere in Cambodia or Vietnam or wherever. People that you are riding past are very interested and intrigued by what you're doing. And sort of like, when you're on the loaded bike, you sort of stick out like the proverbial sore thumb. I could just imagine arriving at Disneyland, you're at the hotel, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, you're just here for the attractions and the rides.
Yeah, people don't even notice you in the U.S. compared to how they see you in the foreign countries.
That first trip you were talking about, under the guise of just getting the summer off, had you done any sort of mini bicycle tours before that trip? Because that's quite an undertaking to do as your first tour. Like I'm thinking coast to coast, so it's almost like the Transamerica route. If I remember correctly, that's almost like 7,000 kilometres or more. Like, to decide, I'm going to get the summer off under this guise and do that. What was your experience of riding before this trip?
Well, that is the only trip that I can say I know the miles. I still remember it was 3,309.4 miles. And I remember that to this day, but I can't remember any of the other trips, but that one I remember. And probably the reason that I took that trip when I did was a coworker. Well, actually, she worked in radiation and X-ray, and I worked in respiratory. And she offered to follow me in my car if I wanted to go across the country on my bike. So that was easy on me because I didn't have to, that wasn't a fully loaded. And I always had a support system, even though I rode every mile. But when I got someplace, if we had to go 50 miles to find a campsite, we could do that. Or on a bicycle alone, I couldn't do that. So it was kind of a way, it was a big trip. And it was big for me and probably big for my friend Gail. But in a way, I don't want to say it was cheating, but it made it easier to ease into a big trip like that.
Yeah, I could see that. It's funny. Some people, I think, if you want to find a way to ease into a big trip, take some small trips. But I could see, well, just take a big trip, but be supported.
Yeah.
Take away the idea that you're not traveling with luggage on your bike and stuff like that. But did you find physically, though, was it like every other sort of bike tour that I've had experience with? The first few days are physically maybe a little bit painful, but after the first week or so, you just get into the rhythm and the flow of what you're asking your body to do day in, day out?
Yeah, for me, I think even with that trip and all my subsequent trips, it takes me a little longer to kind of feel in the groove. And like this trip here, Cambodia is very flat, at least where I am. So there's almost there's no hills for like miles and miles and miles. So my riding didn't involve any hills or any extremes other than the heat. So when I got here, and also when I got to Seattle, when I started stage 1 of the National Park Tour, I gave myself 2 weeks to feel okay and a month to feel normal. But when I went to Seattle, I was like day 1 hills, and I didn't have hills in Cambodia. My bicycle that I had before, it was the long haul trucker and the troll. They weighed, total weight with the bike without food and water was about 135 pounds.
That'd be like 60 kilos.
Something like that. Do the math here. Yeah, 61.
61 kilos. Wow. Oh, by the way, how about my guess there?
I know. It's like, you were 1.3 off. So, yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah. It's worse Fahrenheit to Celsius. We won't even go there, but continue on.
But I never minded, like, the time when the weight really bothers me is if I stop on a hill and then I have to start up again. Sometimes it was too hard to start, so I would have to walk up the hill, push it a little bit. But once you're moving, the weight really never seemed to bother me that much. But I still wanted to get lighter, and on this trip, I lightened things up and got smaller panniers and giving up a few things. And when I look back on the first trip, the Around the World in 2018, I had unbelievably stupid things in my panniers. And I'm not even going to mention what they were.
Oh, no, you have to. I have to ask you for what one of them was. There has to be something.
I had a full-size tripod. Because of my stroke, I had a full-size blood pressure cuff. And I had a drone. I carried around, the portable hard drives.
Yeah.
That are kind of twice the size of a pack of cards. But I had 14 of them in my panniers.
Wow. Actually, there has to be a call out to why you had this. And listeners, I will post links to Scott's Instagram and YouTube in the show notes and your website as well, Scott. Photography is definitely a passion of yours. And so the full-length tripod, the drone, all the hard drives, I'm assuming this is because you know you're going to be doing a lot of stuff with photography on this trip.
Yeah. And my plans were to do a lot more than I ended up doing. So a lot of that stuff got whittled down. And when I first started out, I had like the big cameras and the big lenses, and I knew right away I'd have to give those up to travel by bicycle because they're just too big, too heavy. And so I had to switch to mirrorless. And so I have a smaller setup and just one lens. And most of the photography I do now is with my phone, like most people, because it's convenient. It's with you all the time. So
there is an adage, the best camera that you can use is the one that you have access to in your hands, right?
Exactly.
And look, there's different levels of phones, but there's an element, especially if we're talking like iPhones and I guess the latest Samsungs as well. They're actually pretty decent.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying by any stretch do they, replace your full camera kit there, but they're actually not bad.
Yeah.
You could take a photo on an iPhone, especially a Pro model now, and you could quite happily get that blown up and put on the wall. It's going to make great an image. Do you still have the drone, or you left the drone behind as well?
No, the drone, let's see. I had a big drone in the beginning, the Phantom 4, and that fit in my panniers. I don't know how, with everything else. And then I had a smaller Mavic Pro, and I got rid of that near the end of stage 1. And I just found that I wasn't using it that much. And it's like, it's not so heavy, but it's kind of bulky. So it's taken up a lot of space that I could otherwise use.
You mentioned about taking the blood pressure monitor because of your stroke. I imagine, like most people, a stroke doesn't come as a planned event.
No.
You had only just moved from the States to Cambodia a year beforehand.
Yeah, I moved in September of 2015, and the stroke was the end of April 2016. So basically 8 years ago, almost to the day now.
I mean, speaking to you now and knowing what you've undertaken, maybe I'm incorrect in assuming this, but it feels like you've made a pretty good recovery since that.
Yeah, the recovery was actually very quick. I live in Siem Reap, Cambodia, which is a small town right next to Angkor Wat, so it's a tourist town. But the hospitals are not like you have in Australia and America and even Bangkok. I had to be flown to Bangkok, and I felt after 30 years in the medical field, I felt much more comfortable when we rolled into the emergency room, and it's like, oh, I feel like I'm home now because all the familiar equipment and everything around the room just made me feel much more safe. But I think it was about a day and a half before they flew me there. And I had pretty good movement by that point, and I have no idea why. But I had to ask my neurologist in Bangkok, it's like, did I actually have a stroke? Because look at me. I mean, when it happened, I thought I just bought a brand new motorcycle, literally like 2 weeks before. I had to crawl out of my apartment with one side paralyzed because the ambulance never answered in Siem Reap. And I thought, well, my life is over because, I'm just going to be paralyzed on that one side. And the neurologist said, well, based on the amount of time and the number of times that I kind of went paralyzed and the fact that part of my brain is dead from the MRI, he said, you definitely had a stroke. So how I came out okay or so okay, I have no idea why. And in Cambodia, I don't know how they say it in Khmer, but a stroke is like half body because half your body goes paralyzed. And you see in Cambodia a lot of people walking around that definitely had a stroke, the way they walk. And every time I see them, which is every couple of days at least, I think I was that close to that being me. And here I am riding a bicycle around the world. So I have no idea what came about that made my situation more fortunate than so many others.
Yeah, I mean, you'll never know. Because then your impetus to actually travel and take up touring in the manner that you have and see so much and experience so much. The stroke was the jolt to get your health in order. It reminds me very early on when I released this podcast, I interviewed an awesome guest, Robert Reynolds. Hi, Robert. who actually also spends quite a lot of his time in Southeast Asia and is there touring at the moment. Anyway, Robert was a painter, an artist, like art gallery type, very, very good.
Okay.
And he suffered a stroke, which affected the vision in one of his eyes and unfortunately also affected his ability to be able to paint now. And since then, he has decided he wants to see as much as the world as possible with his remaining vision. And so now he goes on bike tours. And I sort of feel it's sort of semi-similar in that you've had something like a possible life-changing event that you have come out of, which has given you the motivation to do so much more and experience so much more now.
Yeah. I wonder what I would have done if I wasn't a bicyclist in the past and didn't enjoy long distance cycling and wasn't getting jealous every time I saw a long distance cyclist come through Siem Reap, which was quite often. I always wondered, I wish I could do that. I wish I could do that. And it's like, well, why can't you do it? Anybody could do it if they want to. You just have to give up this to get that. And it's the decisions that you make. If I didn't have that background, I wonder what I would have done. Obviously, my life would have been different. Better, worse, I don't know, but different.
I mean, you did move to Cambodia. I mentioned it in my introduction. You made a decision to become financially poor and experientially rich. I guess this is taking it to another level. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe this is an assumption of mine, but you don't make that move without giving a certain amount of luxuries away as well. Like you might be able to live a fine life monetary wise, but it's a different type of setting for your life, so to speak.
Yeah, it's very, very different. But working in the healthcare field for 30 years, I did mostly neonates and pediatrics and did transport 25 of those 30 years, but I also did adult work. And I learned so much from my patients and my patients' families. And I realized that in America, especially, so many people are so focused on retirement that they forget to live. And then they actually retire and they don't know how to live because they never did. And they don't know what to do. And maybe they go back to work. And maybe you make it to retirement and you're too tired, too sick, because for whatever reason. And I said, well, I want to get out and do things while I still can. I did that when I was 55, so now I'm 63. And what would have happened if I waited to 63 to retire and then move? What shape would I have been in? Would I had a stroke? I mean, nobody knows. So for me, I wish I could have done what I did at 40 because it's not that difficult to travel very inexpensively. If you're somebody that likes those $500 a night rooms, you just need a lot more money. But in Asia, things are so cheap. It was easy for me to make the break and just be able to go there. And I called it my work avoidance plan because I wasn't actually retired until I actually retired. So I was doing it to kind of avoid work. And throughout the years, I did less and less work because I wanted to travel more and more. And then I just made the big move to make basically travel my whole life.
Listeners, I mentioned to Scott before I press record, I can only imagine he'd look at a map now and it's like a storybook. There's so many experiences now within every centimetre of where you've travelled there. And I just think of all the experiences that you've really given yourself. Making that decision to leave the US is one thing, but now taking on this type of travel experience is very, very different because I feel I'm biased potentially, but I think listeners to the show probably agree with me. I feel slow travel's the best form of travel. It's the most immersive form of travel as well. You sort of, on a bicycle, you're slow enough without being super slow that you sort of experience the countryside. You feel the intonations of the landscape, you visually see and smell and hear the sounds, as opposed to sort of being fast transported from one tourist site to the next. You're sort of seeing the in-between and you're on display. I imagine there, Scott, when you're traveling through Southeast Asia and in many countries, especially on a bike with 61 kilos, you are so on display when you're going through villages and cities and towns there. People will be so intrigued to see you there.
Yeah, there's a lot of interaction. And I think one thing that makes it nice, I also ride a motorcycle whenever I can and tour Southeast Asia. And it's a very different experience because you'll still get people that will come up to you and kids that'll wave and run out from their house. But when you're on a bicycle, that's like tenfold because you're not going to scare anybody because you're so vulnerable. You're just kind of out there. And when I started my trip back in 2018, basically I got rid of everything in Cambodia. So everything I owned was on my bike, which is probably why it weighed so much. But people would ask me, well, where is your home? I go, I don't have no, but where do you No, I don't have a home. I'm living off of my bike. And they just, well, where do you keep no, I don't have a home. And they just couldn't comprehend that somebody would not have a place to call home.
I guess you're traveling with your home if you've got a tent there as well. Actually, on that concept of a tent being your home with wild camping, I know through interviewing various guests now who've travelled through Southeast Asia, due to the climate, a lot of people actually spend less and less time wild camping or camping in their tent because accommodation is just cheaper to come by, and especially if it's wet season, it just makes more sense. Is that the same for yourself there, Scott?
Yeah, for the most part, I carried before, like in the first 2 years, I had my camping equipment, but I rarely used it. In Myanmar, there was quite a few days that there weren't any accommodations. And there, legally, you could only go in a guest house that had the okay from the government to house foreign people. So you were kind of limited on where you could stay in Myanmar. And camping is not allowed in Myanmar. And staying in somebody's home is not allowed in Myanmar. So there's many times that I would have to stay in a pagoda with the monks, and I would set up my tent because there's no place else around to be able to do that. In Thailand, I tended to stay more in police stations, and they would let me set up my tent inside, outside, wherever it was needed. And then also in India, I never stayed in my tent, but unfortunately, some of the places you stay, they don't change the sheets and the pillowcases between people. And it could be, not just one night, but it was just, my standards have decreased quite a bit over these years and what I will accept and what I won't accept. And that one is just like a step too far for me. But because I had my camping gear, I could just lay my ground cloth on the bed and use my own pillow, use my sleeping bag, and be able to sleep. So I had a bathroom, I had what I needed, but I stayed clean without having to sleep in beds like that.
Well, yeah, I could just imagine. Ugh, just thinking of that. I wonder then, we've sort of talked a little bit about where you've been already, but you have a stroke, you get jolted into, I need to change things. You go on a ride and make a decision, I'm going to go on a long distance ride. It's going to cover many countries and over many years. I want to know, how do you plan a trip that's so big? Because I get insights from you speaking already, Scott, that you're not someone who's detailed day by day your itinerary. There's a lot of unknown there. But just in general, how do you plan what you actually want to see and where you actually want to go?
Well, that becomes difficult because every time you go someplace, you run into people that tell you, oh, you should go here, you should go there. So things are going to change. And I mean, I have a rough idea of my world trip and like the end of the trip, which I never know if that's truly going to be the end, but it will be going from Alaska to the tip of South America. So that'll be like the last big part. In the United States, I was supposed to do, when the pandemic happened, I happened to ride into Cambodia on March 1st of 2020 and decided to stay for the pandemic because I lived there before and I felt comfortable. But I was supposed to go up through China, Mongolia to Europe and then go down Africa, then do the trip I'm doing now, the 51 national parks, and then end up in Alaska and go down to South America. But the pandemic kind of changed it because the borders weren't opening and I really needed to get back out on my bike. I gained quite a bit, 22 kilograms during the pandemic. And so in addition to my heavy bike, I also had the heavy me that I had to push up those hills. And luckily that weight came off pretty quick. So I have like a total idea of what I want to do. But like the 51 national parks, I kind of have a route because there's no straight line to do all the national parks. I'm going all over, up and down and around in the U.S. But day to day, I can like waver a little bit and I can go here. If I see something I like that might be a couple 100 miles off, it's like, I don't really have a deadline.
Mm.
The only deadline I had on this trip was the eclipse that happened because I had to be on the line of totality. And I really did not like having that constraint. It was very difficult. And hotels that were normally $100 were going for over $1,000 a night.
So you're happy you've got a tent.
Well, except campgrounds were full, and they tent site $150 with a 3-night minimum.
Oh, it's crazy.
And in Texas, 95% of the land in Texas is privately owned.
Yeah, and fenced, I imagine.
Yeah, fenced, ranchers. And if you want to ask somebody, like their driveway is like 3 miles long, so it's kind of hard to go and ask people if you can stay. So that was kind of stressful. I couldn't wait until like the eclipse was over, and it ended up very well. So it worked out. Yeah. So day to day, when I was coming from like the eclipse, I'm outside of Dallas right now, and I would find someplace that, oh, they don't have a place to stay. So, I got to go over this way, maybe 50 miles and then up. And so you just play it by ear and do whatever you have to do to get where you're going. So an overall trip, or an overall view of my world trip, and then the pieces that come together. Once I get out of the United States, then I have to start worrying about visas and how they come into play, like how long you have, where you have to get them, how long you can get, and all that is going to like factor into it. Where in the United States, it's just free. I just stay as long as I want. And I'm planning to finish this in like 3 stages. And if I have to do 4, then I do 4. It doesn't matter.
Where you are now in the US wasn't meant to come at this stage of the overall broader world trip, right? Do you still have it in mind to travel through, Mongolia, Central Asia into Europe?
Oh, yeah. My plan was Cambodia to go. I really want to go to Mongolia. That's always been on my list. And I thought that my trip across the Nullarbor was actually going to be my training for Mongolia. And now after I did the Nullarbor, I think maybe Mongolia should have been the training for the Nullarbor, because I think Mongolia has more people that I'm going to run into than the Nullarbor. Australia as a whole is a whole lot of nothing. And interestingly, the only financial thing I keep track of is my lodging, because I want to kind of minimize that because that's kind of an expensive part. And when I was going to Australia, it's like, oh, I'm going to be shooting out money like nothing.
Mm.
It ended up being my least expensive average night stay out of all the countries, even Southeast Asia. And I think my average over 3 months was like $9.12 a night. And the reason for that is because there's a whole lot of nothing in Australia, so you stay for free.
Because you were staying not in places most nights, right? You were just wherever.
I never stayed in a hotel in the 3 months I was in Australia.
That's pretty good. Because your Australia leg of this world tour, you departed from Sydney and made your way over to Perth?
Yes. I had a hard time. I made it all the way down like through Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia to Bali. And then I was in Bali and I was still trying to figure out, am I going to go Sydney to Perth or Perth to Sydney? And I couldn't figure out. And people talked about the wind, but then I looked up the historical winds and that couldn't give me an answer. And literally it wasn't until 3 days before my flight when I decided I'm going to go to Sydney and then go to Perth. And that ended up to me to be a very good decision. So I'm glad that I did it that way. But I think most people traditionally will do it Perth to Sydney.
If you think of it as well, especially if people are sort of doing Australia as a around the world journey, a lot of people have come to Australia from that Indonesian sort of route, and it makes more sense to drop in on the west coast there as well and continue their journey sort of east, and then from Australia they do New Zealand and then maybe South America or the US as well. What were the prevailing winds like on the Nullarbor for your section there in Australia? Did you have them at your back? Were you blessed with that?
I actually cannot say where the winds came from the most. And I think that comes out no matter what. But the one thing that to me made the decision well worth it, and this wasn't planning by any means, but in Australia, you drive on the left side and the sea is on the left side when you're going east to west. And quite often by the end of the day, the wind is going to come off the sea and cross in front of you from left to right. So when the road trains are going by you and they're creating this enormous amount of wind turbulence. That turbulence is being blown away from me. If I would be going the other way, I'd be on the north side of the Nullarbor, and that wind from the sea would blow that turbulence into me. And as you know, how long the road trains are,
Huge.
that can knock you off like nothing. So that was a blessing that I didn't even realize when I was planning. But I would recommend to anybody to go Sydney to Perth, only because it'll keep that turbulence blowing away from you instead of into you.
Can I ask, just because I'm an Aussie, so sometimes I'm a little bit interested to understand what travellers think of my home country. What was one of the biggest moments or greatest experiences that you look back fondly of in your time in Australia?
Well, one thing that bothers me about Australia is the Aboriginal people, and I know very little about their history. I'm somebody that likes photographing local people, and basically the Aboriginal people want nothing to do with me because I'm white and from their history, and that kind of bothered me quite a bit. But when I was on the Nullarbor, you can hear cars coming like 2 miles behind you, and I heard this car coming, and I could tell that it was kind of a rundown kind of car by the way it sounded. And it was slowing down as it got to me. And I go, okay, so these people want to stop and talk or whatever. And it was a young Aboriginal couple. And the girl, the passenger, she just handed me an ice cold can of Orange Crush.
Oh, nice.
And to me, that was like all this time that, I would walk and the people wouldn't even look at me or acknowledge me. And then here these people, complete strangers, just stop on the side of the road, hand me the Orange Crush and say, have a good day. And to me, that was one of the high points of Australia.
Yeah. Again, the kindness of a complete stranger. I bet you needed that at that point too, because I know the time of year that you were traveling there, it's not cool weather. It's you're a lover of the hot weather. Like, you've adjusted to the heat, haven't you?
Adjusted, I guess it depends on what you mean. I still sweat like a pig, but I can tolerate like 100 degrees, 38, 39 degrees centigrade. And that's kind of normal. Bought my bicycle in March of 2018 in Bangkok. And then I rode it back to Siem Reap. And then I was going to go to the U.S. for 6 weeks. But at the end of April, I said, I have 8 days. What am I going to do? So I said, I'm going to do this 8-day loop around Cambodia. And now April, May is the hottest time of the year in Cambodia. And it's gotten hotter over the last few years. But I'm out on that 8-day tour, and it's like, what the heck were you thinking? You should have stayed home, because it was so hot, and it just drained me day after day. And it was in some remote spots, so you didn't have like water and drinks readily available. It might be like 30 miles, which in a cooler climate isn't that bad. But when it's something that's that hot, and luckily it was flat, so I didn't have like hills to climb on top of that, but I'm used to the heat. And like I said earlier, today was like 80 degrees. And to me, 80 degrees seems like nice fall weather. And actually it's kind of nice and warm weather for people that are kind of used to that kind of thing. But for me, it feels very cool.
When you're actually physically riding your bike, though, I always think perfect sort of temperature. Sorry, I'm going to talk in Celsius now because I cannot do the Celsius Fahrenheit conversion. But I sort of think high teens, low 20s is actually really lovely cycling weather. You're not going to get too hot. You're not going to get too cold.
Exactly.
But we can't control the weather by any measure, so we have to take what we get. Did you ever find yourself in wet season anywhere in Southeast Asia through your travels there?
Yeah, I did 2 tours. My first tour, which was around the world, I started in Cambodia in July, which is the rainy season. And I went Cambodia to the bottom of Vietnam, all the way up to Hanoi, down a little bit, then into Laos, and then down Laos into Cambodia. So that was all in the rainy season. And last year, when I bought this bicycle that I have now, the Bridge Club, I buy my bicycles in Chiang Mai. And so I flew up to Chiang Mai, picked up my bike, and I did another Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia trip. And that was also in the rainy season. But it doesn't rain like continually like a lot of people think. And that's one thing I try to tell people. If you're going to visit Southeast Asia, especially Cambodia, come in the rainy season because it's so much more beautiful. Everything is green. Cambodia, more than Vietnam, dries out in the dry season to where it's dusty. All the trees just have dust on the leaves, and it just looks very barren. But then once it rains and the rice fields are growing, it's just absolutely beautiful. And when it does rain, it's a warm rain. So you're not getting cold. You're not freezing.
Is there a pattern to the rain? Like, does it build up during the morning and then it's an absolute deluge in the afternoon and then clear? Or is it, there's no pattern, it's going to rain on and off during the whole day?
Generally, like in Cambodia and I think all the other places, it tends to rain more towards the late afternoon and then at night. That's just the normal monsoon rains, but they can still have a wet weather pattern that comes in, like here in the U.S., that it'll rain for 2 or 3 days, but that doesn't happen that's just like a rain that's coming through. When I first started my trip, the first 100 days was during the rainy season, and only 4 of those 100 days did I have to ride in the rain, like for most of the day. All the other days, it might rain for an hour, like at lunchtime. You just stop and eat, and it's done. Other times it would start to rain. By the time I got my rain jacket on, it would stop. But only 4 days that I could say it actually rained in that first 100 days.
That's pretty good.
Nothing to be afraid of.
I wonder, Scott, looking at the world with a photographer's eyes, I'm curious to understand, what do you enjoy photographing more? Are you someone who looks forward to those big dramatic landscapes, or are you, street photography in the cities and the vibrance of that is what you thrive on?
Well, before I moved to Cambodia, I was a landscape photographer, and I actually went to Vietnam for a 2-week photo tour, and they had a 4-day add-on to Cambodia in the beginning, and I never even thought about going to Cambodia. And it's like, well, I'm there, I might as well just go for 4 days. All of a sudden, I became like a people photographer because it was so easy to take people pictures in Southeast Asia. I don't do so much people photography like in Australia or the US, and probably because the people are more like me versus in Asia, they're very different. And I remember a monk came up to me once and said, "How come Americans like to take pictures of monks?" I said, "Because we don't have monks. We don't see, but they're all over the place." So, it's kind of interesting and different for us to see that. And I think people find pictures of things that they're not familiar with a little more enjoyable to view than the normal everyday things. With landscape photography, it's much easier to do landscape photography if you have a car because you want the best light. You either get up in the morning or you stay for the evening, and then you have to get from or to your accommodations. Well, on a bike, you just don't have that opportunity to be in the right spot at the right light and to be able to plan things like that. So it's a little bit easier just to run into somebody on the side of the road and then take pictures of them like in a foreign country. And so you have a background that's different. And, I'll be going down the road, and when it's time to eat or to stop for a drink, I'm literally looking at both sides of the road thinking, okay, which one has the better light? And then I start looking at who's in the shop. So who will I be able to possibly get the best photographs of? Because some people don't like to be photographed and other people do. And a lot of times when you stop and take pictures, those that didn't want one kind of change their mind and they do want one because they want to be included. So that's always like on my mind. And I'll always take a picture of somebody in bad light if they want it. I'm not going to do anything with it, but they don't understand the lighting and everything. They just want to be part and they want to be photographed. So you can tell from their faces, the people that want to be photographed. So even if it's one that's going to come out pretty bad because of the lighting, I'll take that because it doesn't cost anything.
I'm just actually thinking it's sort of like a door opener to a conversation and an experience there. And I don't mean conversation as in lots of word exchange, because I imagine there's a lot of places where you just don't have that language. I mean, we do have Google Translate and all those things at times, but I imagine it is like just an amazing window and opportunity to learn a little bit more about them. And that is part of these type of trips.
One of my favorite things to do in Cambodia when I had my big cameras was you would go to a pagoda and they would have all these novice monks and you show up and, they're kind of shy in the beginning, but then they open up and they surround you. And boy, did they have fun when I hand them my big camera. and I use back button focusing. Well, there's no way I can teach them or explain to them what back button focusing is. So all the pictures, they're taking pictures of their friends and me and everything. And all of them come out blurry because they can't focus them because they don't know which button to press. But it's so fun to watch them. They may have their phones that they take pictures with, but then they're trying to maneuver like how to hold the camera. And you might have two monks holding the camera while the other one's taking a picture. And so it does open up a lot of opportunities. Even the shops you stop at, a lot of times the mom and dad want pictures of their kids taken. It's a good experience.
Roles reversed. I certainly know in watching some of your YouTube videos there, which you've posted up through each of the countries you've sort of gone through, you've ended up in a lot of pictures yourself. There's a lot of people that have taken photos of you on their phones as well, right?
Yeah. Oh, boy. In India and Bangladesh especially, people would stop you on the side of the road. They're in a car and they want to get a selfie with you. And you're sitting there and you get your selfie. And then you look behind and there's 5 cars waiting in line to get selfies with you.
How did you find your experience through India, actually? Because I've spoken to a couple of travelers as guests on the show, and it's always been a country which I guess I've been curious about just from what I know, but their experiences as well. Like it's sort of a full-on experience. And how did you find that coming from Southeast Asia?
It's a very interesting country, and I came from... For decades, the land border from Myanmar to India were closed. And 6 months after I started my trip, the land borders opened. And I always wanted to go to Kathmandu. And it's like, I can now ride my bike to Kathmandu because I can go through the border. I didn't even know, when you look at India, it's like a big country. But then they have that little northeastern part, kind of a little arm that comes off. And I didn't even know that was really India. And I went through that, and once I got through the border town, it's like, where are all the people? Everything I've seen on TV my whole life is nothing but constant chaos in India. But where I went through was like farmland and mountainous and very beautiful. And yeah, it would be chaotic when you got to the towns. But so many people in India speak English, so it's very easy to make it through the country. And people were very nice throughout the whole thing. I went from Myanmar to India, into Bangladesh for 2 weeks, back into India, and then through Nepal for a bit, and then back into India. So I kind of went through like in 3 sections, and I was only in that like northeastern part. So there is so much of India that I never got to. And like a lot of the bigger cities like Mumbai, and I can't even imagine what those are like. They are quite noisy, but you feel safe because you're riding your bike in a city and literally you can't fall over because you got motorbikes on one side and a cow on the other side and a tuk-tuk here. Like there's no room to fall over on your bike, and everybody's just kind of going slow and honking and honking and honking. Yeah, it's very interesting.
The noise that you bring up there, that is something that someone else has mentioned to me before as well. I'm actually wondering, what's been the most chaotic country in terms of traffic?
The most I wouldn't say country per se, because you can go through Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and that's pretty chaotic. Or you could be going through New Delhi in India, and that's chaotic. So it kind of depends on where you are. But overall, I would say Bangladesh isn't overly chaotic, but I think they have the worst drivers that I've seen in all the countries I've been to. But India, I would say overall, would probably be the most chaotic.
Hello everyone, I just wanted to take a quick moment to say a big heartfelt thank you to all of you listeners who have given me a small financial donation and supported me on Buy Me a Coffee. All of those donations do make a difference. They help to support the running costs of this podcast so that I can keep producing episodes for you each week. And I really appreciate all of you who've clicked on the Buy Me a Coffee link and sent me through a small donation. If you are listening and would like to support the show, you can do so quite easily. I've provided a link to Buy Me a Coffee You will find it in the show notes if you click on that link, and you can choose to buy me a coffee, which again is just a small donation which helps towards the running costs of the show. Thank you all so much. Okay, now let's go back to the show. Interestingly enough, something that I'm curious about is how much preconception, how much research broadly about a country or an area that you're going to do you undertake before you're there? Apart from what general knowledge you may have already about a place. So, for example, let's talk about Myanmar or Bangladesh. Like, apart from sort of knowing some general stuff about it, when you knew you were traveling there, do you research about it, or do you just go in there with a curious mindset and have that sort of different type of experience? You're not seeking out things, you're just seeing what you're going to experience while you're there.
Yeah, I don't think that I really delve too deep into learning about the country before I get there. I will have, like, my goal in India was to go to the Taj Mahal. So I wanted to get there. But like I said, I didn't even know that northeastern part even existed. So I just kind of, with the visa in mind and my limits and how much time I had to play it by ear. And you learn new things. And when you're there, you learn about new things. And, maybe one day you go left when you were kind of planning to go right. And who knows if it's a better experience or a worse one. But other than some of the big things in Bangladesh, I knew it was a very poor country. I was only given a 2-week visa because I showed up at the border. They didn't know what to do with me. So they gave me a 2-week visa. I didn't have a whole lot of time, but I didn't have anything pinpointed in Bangladesh that I wanted to hit. So basically, if I go to a country, like when I was going to do Vietnam, I said, I want to do Ho Chi Minh, I want to do Hanoi. And then everything else in between was just a bonus.
In a way, you have some destinations, but what makes the trip is the stuff in between as well, a lot of the time.
Exactly.
Was it in Bangladesh that you actually had, you were interrogated by the police there?
Yeah, the first night I got there, Google said there was a guest house in that first town, and there wasn't. And then I had to look for a place. And the hotel owners just let the police know that a foreigner was there. And then they came, and this whole room of police, but you can't tell they're police because they don't have uniforms. And they're asking me all these questions and how long are you here? Why are you here? And then I got a little suspicious because one of the guys, he goes, well, are you working for a magazine? And the only thing I could think of was they actually looked up my name on the internet and saw that I was a photographer and wondered if I had some ulterior motive. So that kind of got me worried. They interviewed me in the lobby. Then they came to the restaurant I was eating at and interviewed me. And then the chief of police came back to the hotel and interviewed me. And he said, we're going to put 2 police in the room next to you overnight. And then in the morning, we're going to follow you. Well, I had no idea what was going on. And, I'm sitting there and I looked up on Google the most likely countries in the world for an American to be kidnapped. And of course, Bangladesh made the top 25. So that didn't make me feel any better as I was sitting there in this very rundown room. And it's like, in the morning, I'm just going 8 miles I'm going back to India. I'm getting out of here. And it turned out that they ended up following me. I stayed the whole 2 weeks, and it ended up being one of my favorite countries. But they did follow me. Every 15 kilometers, I would basically get a new police escort, usually 2 guys on a motorbike, one with a shotgun, and then the other guy. And they would either ride in front of me, ride behind me, or some of them would ride next to me and talk to me the whole 15 kilometers that they were riding. When I would stop for a drink, they would say, or food, they would say, you are a guest, and they would pay for that. And one time they took me to their police station and made me lunch. But I stopped for a break in a small village, and they had a foreign-run women's hospital and a school. And I ended up going back there 2 days later to give a talk to the kids. The headmaster said, can you come back? And they had a guest house there. So I got to talk to some of the foreign workers, and they said they can go into town. That was okay. But if they were to take the train to another city, they would also get a police escort. So that made me feel much better. And basically, they were telling me they wanted me to feel safe. And I think Bangladesh gets a bad rap with many things, and they just don't want any bad things to happen to tourists. So they just kind of wanted to keep an eye on me. And this was relatively soon after the bombing in Sri Lanka. So I think they were at a little heightened wanting to keep people safe. But I had to get selfies. Every time I got two new cops, they had to get selfies with me. And when I wanted to go to dinner, I would have to call downstairs to the hotel and say, oh, I want to go to dinner. And they would call the police and they would come back and pick me up and take me to dinner. And one time I had 4 cops with shotguns walking me up the first floor restaurant. And I felt like I was a mafia informant in like New York City because, who am I to have like all these people with shotguns taking me to lunch or dinner?
I've interviewed people who have had that police escort thing happen to them before. Helen Datey, she had a bizarre scenario in Saudi Arabia with police escorts following her. And then I know I've had guests in Pakistan. And actually, even in Pakistan, it was hard for them to actually be cycling because more often than not, they would just want you to be in the police car and they're sort of just driving you point to point.
Yeah.
A very different experience you had there in Bangladesh. Do you think, because you mentioned you got there, you didn't have a visa, they didn't know what to do with you, so that they gave you sort of 2 weeks. Do you think, is there actually a way to apply beforehand? And if you had that, do you think your experience would be different or not at all? This would just be how they're protecting you as a guest in their country.
Well, I think it depends on, because other bicyclists that I talked to that went through the country, they didn't have an escort. So I think it just happened that the guest house that I stopped at in the first town called the police, not called the police on me, but just called the police to say, oh, we have a foreigner here. And so maybe not every guest house would have done that. There was a 20-minute window that I didn't have an escort because every night when they dropped me off, they would say, okay, what time do you want us to be here? And I'd say like 9 o'clock. So they'd be there at 8 o'clock. And one day they just weren't there. And it's like I had to go because I had to get my miles in. And I was saying, oh, I got to leave. And the hotel staff was, oh, they're coming. Just wait. And finally I said, I just got to leave. So I left on my own and started going. And I found out that to find a white bicyclist in Bangladesh takes about 20 minutes. The chief of police actually was the one that found me. And then he went with me alone. He had his white shirt and everything before the 2 guys caught up. In that one village with the hospital, I was able to walk around and do photography with some of the people in the village. And I was invited to a wedding and I walked to the wedding on my own. So there I had some freedom. And I don't want to say freedom like, I was in custody. I never felt uncomfortable. Well, one time we were going through kind of a bigger town. So the police in front of me, they put their sirens on and the guy's like pointing back to me going, American, American. And I'm going, this is supposed to make me feel safe. You're pointing me out like, oh, this is the one you want to target. This is him.
Do you think, because you mentioned also Bangladesh was one of the favourite countries you travelled through, putting aside being encumbered by a police escort, and always having people, you weren't there to experience it on your own, but do you actually think there was also an element that you sometimes experienced more because of them? Like you were mentioning how there were times where the person doing the escort was actually just right next to you talking the whole time. So that's part of the experience too then, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite pictures, 2 things I try to do in every country I go to, and that's get a haircut. And the second is to go to the movies. I like going to the cinema. Since I started my trip in 2018, I've been to about, I think it's up to 285 movies.
Wow.
And in other places, I couldn't find a theater in Bangladesh, but I didn't know like if the cops were going to have to sit next to me with their shotguns and if I was going to have to buy them popcorn. So it was a weird thing. But I have a picture of me getting my hair cut in Bangladesh, and the guy in the seat next to me is a cop holding a shotgun.
I need to have a look at that picture.
I mean, I wouldn't have that picture or that experience without it. And the place where they took me and they made me lunch was actually next to a school. And if you saw the Bangladesh video, there's a spot where all these school kids were like coming up to me, almost like I was a rock star, where they're wanting to shake my hand and everything, and they're like mobbing me. And that was because the police brought me to that school to visit. So without them, that would have never happened.
The way you experience the country has changed because of it, but it's also brought with it its own experiences as well.
Exactly.
Your decision to go to the States now, you mentioned it was sort of spurred on by the pandemic. It wasn't going to be changing soon. So your original idea of traversing your way, making your way through Central Asia and Europe sort of stopped and you went back to the US. And now it's definitely not a point-to-point trip that you're on. You're sort of going up, round and everywhere because you want to visit all, I think it's 51 national parks in the lower 48.
Yes, 51. Mm-hmm.
How has that been, having had the years of experience prior of all the Southeast Asian stuff? Because I know that we talked at the start of the show how you'd undertaken those 2 tours in the 90s and I think in the 2000s of through the US. So you've done some long distance travel there. But I can only imagine with the experiences that you've gained since 2018 and this trip started, that your touring mindset has probably changed a bit. And I'd love to know, was there sort of like a reverse culture shock?
I've been basically out of the US since 2015. And I think around the world, there's been quite a few changes since 2015 to now. And especially like the United States is very different. And it was weird because I flew from Cambodia and I had to go to Phoenix where I had my old broken bike and the parts. And I had to like combine all my panniers and decide what I was going to do. I think I was there 4 days, but it literally took me like a couple weeks before I really realized I was in the United States. I think before it would be, oh, I'm back home. But now it was like, oh, I'm visiting and it's so different from what I was used to. And one of the things, like, I didn't take money out of an ATM for over a week when I got to the US because everything was, tap, tap, tap. Every time I would pull like my wallet, I only had Cambodian money in I didn't have any American money. And I finally took $100 out and that took me like 3 weeks to get rid of. There's a lot of things that are very different. I was thinking about how different things are from my tour in 1990 to this one. And I'm in 2 different parts of the country. And, the US is very big and very different depending on where you go. But I notice people are in more of a hurry and people coming at me in a car don't wave as often as they did in the past. People don't approach me as often. And I found out like when stage 1 ended abruptly when my bike broke, it was very interesting crossing the state line where I realized that people think that I'm homeless because I'm on a bicycle. And sometimes I'm walking down the street and like I have my laundry bag and I'm walking on the side of this busy road that people normally don't walk down because there's too much traffic. And I'm thinking, yeah, people just think I'm homeless and I don't have a home. And I still maintain my apartment in Cambodia, but people's perception of me, and like in the Northwest when I started, quite a few homeless people actually have bicycles with panniers. And when you're riding on a tour and you see somebody up ahead with panniers, it's like, oh, it's a bike tour. I got to get up and talk to them. And then you find out, oh, that's the homeless guy. And so we don't have the same experiences to talk about. And the perception isn't like just in my head, but it's like when I needed to get a ride, the way people treated me and just yelled at me and walked by me and lied to me. And that was in Texas. And that was kind of like an eye opener where the day before in New Mexico, I stopped at a convenience store. One of my favorite things is I have a little chair that I can take out and sit on and I'm eating and people are bringing me food, trying to give me money. The bread guy said, oh, I have extra loaves of bread in the truck. And so they were treating me with compassion because they thought I was homeless. And the other people were treating me with disdain because they thought I was homeless. But now I look through that lens when I have interactions with people. So that's a big change where when I first did my trip, I didn't have panniers because I had my friend Gail that was driving my car and picking me up everywhere. And people would talk to me much, much more. And I also noticed that people on tour, definite touring people, they don't stop and talk like they used to 20 years ago. people, even on tour, tend to be more in a hurry. And to me, if somebody's coming the opposite way, I want to know what to expect. And then they might want to know what to expect, what's ahead of them. But they don't even stop.
It's really interesting because it's definitely, it's often a highlight for people that I speak to on the show.
Yeah.
The other bike travelers that they meet on their journey and learning from them, and that swapping and exchange of experience and information sharing and stuff as well. Like people seek that out, and it's a big thing. Interestingly, when you were talking about how you're perceived by people and being perceived as homeless, it automatically reminded me of a previous guest, Daniel Troyer, who did a long journey through the US from west to east and then back again. And he documented his experiences as part of an amazing documentary. But as he was making his way back, as his appearance started turning more shabby, as in he had a beard and everything, and he looked a bit scruffier, how people perceived him changed so much. And they treated him like a homeless person, and they didn't care for him as much through that. And they showed him a bit more disdain. And it was actually homeless people who started caring and showing him more compassion.
Yeah.
It is interesting being able to reflect back on how things have changed. But I feel sad that bike travelers aren't taking the time out to, I mean, obviously it's not all of them, but yeah, like you've obviously noticed a stark difference there.
Yeah. And some of it may be that the roads are much different now than they were before. So if they're going the opposite way, sometimes it's kind of difficult to cross the road to talk to each other because there's a lot of traffic. So, I mean, there's things that may lead into that. It's something that I notice. And there is a route called the Southern Tier that goes across the United States from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida. And that's one of the ACA routes that go across the country. So I was on part of that route. So I was seeing a lot of bicyclists. But now I have to go to the national parks. So I can't follow like those routes that most people are on. So I will go weeks and weeks and weeks without ever seeing another touring bicyclist because they're just not going to be on the roads that I'm on. And one of my favorite foods is actually ice cream, and probably my favorite food. And back home in Rochester, we had an ice cream place called Abbott's. And over the years, Abbott's has opened some shops in Texas and Florida. And it's my favorite ice cream back home. So there's actually one. I'm south of Dallas. I'll be going into downtown Dallas tomorrow. And then one day north of there is Abbott's. So I actually made my trip go to the Abbott's so I can have my favorite ice cream before I turn east to go that way.
I have to ask, what flavor is your favorite ice cream?
Well, I mean, my favorite at Abbott's is actually vanilla. They have vanilla custard.
Vanilla's awesome, though.
Yeah, it is. But as far as, I mean, Ben and Jerry's, I like Ben and Jerry's. So I don't have like a favorite. But today, ate at a place that had a milkshake. And like in Southeast Asia, you can't get a real milkshake. And it was so good to have like a real milkshake today. Even if you go to McDonald's, the milkshakes are not even cold. So I don't know what they're made of. Obviously not milk. I mean, they're cold, but they're not freezing like a milkshake should be. So this was like real ice creams. I got strawberries, so they had chunks of strawberry in it. And it was so nice to be able to have that. You know, some of the little things you miss. I can get ice cream in Southeast Asia. I can get Ben and Jerry's. I can get Haagen-Dazs. But the roadside ice cream places like we have in America, I look forward to here. And one of the big things I missed in Southeast Asia, I'm looking at my bicycle, is Amazon. And here we have Amazon lockers. So basically they're lockers at different gas stations and different places around towns. So I can order, I needed to get some of the little energy gel things, and I needed a little net to kind of go over the back of my thing. So a couple days ago, I ordered it, and then I picked it up yesterday. I just picked a place that's on my route, and it's just like, click, 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 enter, and then boom, what you want is right there. Where in Asia, in Cambodia, if I want something, it may take me over a month to get something shipped, something simple, and it's generally expensive. So it's kind of nice to be here now, and it's getting warmer now, so I'm going to be able to go to more roadside ice cream things, and I'll be able to buy things on Amazon. That's not what a bike trip is about. But it's those little things that...
Yeah, and it's the conveniences when you're on tour to know that I can actually just get something in a couple of days on the route put there for me and I can pick it up, because I could imagine what it's like. It's a whole different level of problems to solve when you're in a foreign country where you rightly said it might take a month to get what you needed. You're on your third bike now and you had bike pieces break. I'm interested to know what mechanical you had on the first bike, the long haul trucker, and was it just end of life for that bicycle, or?
No, that was actually a very confusing and interesting to me thing. There was something that was going on with the bike that basically made it slow down at random times. And I generally ride 10 to 12 miles an hour, so about 20 kilometers an hour. And all of a sudden, it would be like somebody was on the back of the bike just weighing it down. And it would just happen randomly. And this was going on for weeks and like 1,000 miles. And I assumed it was the hub. I had people take the hub apart. There was nothing. Nothing was rubbing the brakes. Nobody could figure it out. I was asking on Facebook, and people are saying, well, maybe you're too old. Maybe you're too tired. Maybe you're crazy. Nobody could figure it out. And it ended up not being the bicycle, but how I was carrying the stuff on the bicycle. And because once I reconfigured it, that went away. Well, what happened was it was happening like for months. And so finally I just said, I'm done with this bike. So Surly actually sent me a new frame, even though none of us thought it was the frame. But they sent me a new frame to Chiang Mai, Thailand, and paid for the guy to switch everything over. And that's when I got the Troll. And so I got that, and I went into Myanmar. Like 5 days into Myanmar, boom, the same problem happened. And it's like, this cannot be the bicycle,
No.
because this is two completely different bikes. So I figured out it was like the way it was carrying the extra water. I would take that water out, it would go away. I would put the water back, it would come back. I would put the water in different places, it wouldn't happen. And nobody could figure it out. And it was funny because I was in Myanmar before the Troll started acting up. And I was at a guest house and I ran into 3 other bicyclists. And I was telling them that story and they go, oh, you're that guy? They
You
read
got the
about
reputation.
me on Facebook.
I love it.
And it's like, yeah, that was me. So it wasn't the bike. It was just an unusual situation. And then the Troll, when I got the Troll, the derailleur just kind of buckled on itself and it kind of bent the frame and everything. And I was kind of tired at that time and running out of money. And I said, I just need to regroup and I'm going to go back to Cambodia where it's cheap. I'll figure things out. And so I replanned kind of what I was doing. And that worked out for the better because I have more of a foundation for what I'm going to do in the future.
You like the setup of that bike now on the Bridge Club. It's a bit more mountain bikey. It's suiting the style of travel that you're doing as well.
Yeah.
Wow, you've got so much travel ahead of you as well, really. When I think about what your plans are and what you want to see, I know there was a break with COVID, but notwithstanding, you started in 2018, we're in 2024, and I'm excited for what's to come ahead for you. It's so much.
In the beginning, I said I'm going to do this as long as I'm physically able, financially able, and mentally able. Because as a tourist, bicycle tourist, most people think the hard part is your legs and the muscles and the work, but the hard part is your mind. Because every day you have to get out and do the same thing and you have to plan. And a lot of people can't deal with not knowing where they're going to stay that night. And to do it day after day after day, to me, I just love being someplace I've never been before. I always wonder what's over that hill, what's around that bend. And that's what kind of keeps me motivated to be able to keep going and to be outside every day, most days. It hasn't rained on me yet in this part of the trip. And there's been some big storms in Texas, but I've just missed them.
Very fortunate there as well. Scott, something I'd love you to tell me is I'd like you to take myself and our listeners, transport us back in time to one day of your trip. It can be from any country. It can be from any place. I just want to know what it was like on that one day.
I'm going to kind of throw this back on you a little bit.
Oh, okay.
So I have a day in mind.
Okay.
If this doesn't work. So I'm going to have you pick one day from March of 2018 to March of 2020. And I'll see on that day if something happened that I remembered, and then
Okay.
I'll tell you about it.
Oh.
And if not, then I have one day that I have in mind.
So hang on, one day from March 2018 to March 2020.
Yeah.
Maybe I should choose a significant day for me anyway. How about my birthday? Oh, do I want people knowing that? If you want to send me a gift, feel free. The 5th of November. Let's go 2018.
So the 5th of November?
That's the one.
Oh, I was in Australia.
That's relevant.
Okay, Conn River. So I can say I remember like the day, 2 days before, I stayed in Malakuta. You know Malakuta?
I know exactly where you are. You're in Lake's Entrance near Cann River there too. Yep.
Yeah.
Do you know how we would call Malakuta in Australia? Cooter, because we shorten everything.
Yeah, okay. And that's where I learned about the Australian wave. You know, the flies come by and you're trying to swat them away, and people across the street think you're waving at them.
Definitely.
But yeah, when I went into Malakuta, people in Australia when I told them I was going to go down the East Coast from Sydney, they said, "Oh, that's way too busy. Don't go down there. Don't go down there." And I go there and it's like, this place is empty. I could go like a day without seeing a convenience store. And there was a storm coming up. So I saw Malakuta, which was about 15 miles off the road to the ocean. And I ended up staying there 2 days. And it was very nice. It did rain quite a bit and everything. And I saw my only echidna on that road, on the side of the road. So it was kind of interesting to run across that. And, you know, then I had to bike the 15 miles back out to the main road and everything. But sadly, a month or two later, that town burned to the ground
It did.
in the fires. And they had to rescue people from the sea. You know, I can envision the town. I can't envision what it might look like. Well, by now they probably rebuilt it and everything.
The amazing thing also with and I can't imagine, I know exactly what you're talking about because I was in Australia when all that happened, and it felt like our whole country was on fire at one stage. And the thing that I will say is the Australian bush, which is, you know, all our trees and everything there, what people would call forests, I guess, in other places, the Australian bush has this amazing way of regenerating. And so you'll go back to those places that it was like a blowtorch, burnt them to the ground, razed them to the ground, black char, everything. And then all of a sudden, you know, some rain happens and a month or two later, and all of a sudden it regenerates. And that always strikes me, that new life, that new green that erupts there. Something else quickly that I thought of when you're telling me about this day is how you mentioned you saw an echidna.
Mm-hmm.
There's an old wives' tale that if you see echidnas out and about on the move, it means that rain's on its way or coming. And I'm just thinking, it was wet. So there you go.
Yeah.
Wives' tales generally
it rained
true.
the next day.
They're pretty cool animals.
They are. They scare me.
Oh, okay.
And you're sitting there going, what the hell are you talking about? But because they look like a porcupine.
Yeah.
And in the U.S., porcupines will throw their quills.
Oh, really?
You'll see dogs with like 30 quills stuck in their faces because they were sticking their nose. So echidnas they don't do that. And they're so small.
They curl up in a
and
ball.
They're cute. Yeah. Especially when they go, hello. It's like, oh, he's gone. Yeah, he was cute.
Definitely. Scott, it's an absolute pleasure to talk with you. And I can only imagine what you must be looking forward to now with your trip ahead as well, because you've got so much to look forward to. And all of it, I think the best experiences that you have to look forward to, none of us know will exist because they're all the unplanned things, right?
Exactly.
If people want to watch this trip unfold for you, I've mentioned you have a YouTube channel and I've mentioned some of your photos as well on your Instagram. What's the best way for people to find you there online?
Probably the Instagram. And I'm trying to post like once a day, but I'm pretty bad at it because I'm actually kind of lazy, especially a day with a tent. You got to take everything down, get on the bike, you got to ride, you got to plan the day, you got to look for things. But Instagram, which is under my name, is one way. And then YouTube, which I'm a little bit behind on the videos, but I tried to catch up before my trip. And I should be posting weekly soon on this part of the trip. But that's under Strokes to Spokes, a bicycle ride around the world. So if you search Strokes to Spokes, you should be able to find it.
I'll provide links to both of those avenues of keeping up with Scott's story there on the socials on into the show notes as well. So, Scott, as I look to wrap the show up, there's questions I finish which I ask all of my guests. The first one is music related because as a guest now of Seek Travel Ride, you get to have a song of your choice added to the Seek Travel Ride music playlist that is now available on Spotify and Apple Music as well. Each guest picks a song which they would choose to be the soundtrack for their adventure. What song are you going to choose?
I was just listening to that soundtrack 2 days ago as I was riding.
So eclectic, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, many of the songs I've never heard before. So for me, it's like a new, some of the ones are, ones that I would remember as an American, but because many of your guests are not American, they have their own style of music and everything. So I find that nice to have that change. But for me, I mean, my favorite song always has been, especially on the bike, is Freebird by Leonard Skinner.
Oh, cool. Awesome. You are down. Do you find that you listen to music to keep you motivated to turn the pedals sometimes or take you away things? Like, do you use music a lot? You were talking you listen to the playlist. Do you do that often? Like, listen to music every day?
I listen to music. I listen to podcasts. And like you are changing my trip because I never knew I wanted to go to the Faroe Islands on a bicycle. I mean, who would know that?
Oh, thank you, Agnieszka. Actually, just a quick shout out, Agnieszka Baginska. If you haven't listened to her episode yet, people, definitely check it out. Awesome Polish bike adventurer, and she's currently in Peru.
Cool. Yeah, so music, podcasts, audiobooks. Like I had a new book that I kind of wanted to start, but I'm coming into Dallas, and I might have to take a little trip, like fly for a few days to go somewhere. So I didn't want to start a new book. But when it comes to a book, unabridged, like Stephen King is good because like 23 hours.
You can cover a lot of days in that 23 hours. That's great.
But yeah, so I have a mix of depending on the mood and everything.
Okay, final two questions, and you will know what these are because you listen to the show, but you get to answer them. You got a choice one day. You can choose to ride forever up a constant, never-ending, leg-burning climb. Let's say it's like 10, 11% gradient, right? Or you could choose to ride into a headwind. Which one are you going to choose?
Well, since I started this trip in Pecos, Texas, and went down to Big Bend National Park and then went east through West Texas, which is known for its extreme high winds in the spring, I'm picking the mountain.
I had a fair idea that you were going to do that.
Yeah, the first 2 weeks of my riding, and like many people, I would ride my bike in Cambodia, but it wasn't like touring riding. So you kind of expect to get in shape when you start riding, which normally works out okay. But starting out in West Texas in the windy season is not a good choice to start your training. And in 2 weeks, I actually lost 15 pounds riding because it was so tough. I would say it was the toughest 2 weeks of all of my touring I've ever done.
You've made peace with the wind and now you're just seeking out the hills. See, I tried to word the question to heavily weight it towards the wind. Like, let's try and make the hill just as horrible as, and the climb as horrible as possible. But nah, there's no way. And I'm a climb lover, so welcome aboard the climbing train to the 90+% of guests who also choose hill climb. Okay, final question for you, Scott. You're going to be riding your bike one day, just 4 hours, and you have a choice to spend those 4 hours riding your bike with someone else or 4 hours riding your bike alone. Which one are you going to choose?
Well, if I was riding into the wind, I'd want to be with people, so I'd have somebody to bitch about the wind to. But generally, because I ride alone, I would choose to ride with somebody.
Oh, I love that. It's interesting how you say that because some people would say, I ride alone, and I like that, so I just want to be alone. And some people say, I'm always alone, so hey, how about I have some company? I love that can go either way, and I love your answers to that as well. Scott Sharick, it has been an absolute pleasure to finally get to record with you and to hear about the stories and experiences of this multi-year world tour that you are on. I'm super excited to see how the rest of this journey unfolds for you. And I will be keen to keep an eye and see those images and videos of your trip as you make your way through so many more countries all around the world. Thank you so, so much for sharing your stories and experiences here on the podcast for Seek Travel Ride.
Okay, thank you for talking with me.
I absolutely enjoyed my chat there with Scott, learning so much more about him and this trip and the way that he approaches each and every day. There are a few things which I really took away from there, and one was just the beauty of the unplanned, not knowing where you're going to end up each day. I know that for some of my listeners, that would be a massive stress and unease, because there are people that it's just in our nature that planning every single thing out and having an itinerary to follow is what makes them feel stress-free. But for the rest of us, the idea that unexpected things are ahead of us on the road, we're not sure what's going to be up ahead of us, and that can be quite energizing too. And I definitely got that feel listening to Scott Sherry's story that that's the case for him there. The other thing was that he left the US originally to move to Cambodia to become financially poor but experientially rich. And it's interesting that since then it took a stroke to sort of jolt him into the appreciation of good health, and how those of us with good health, we don't need to take things for granted. We can actually use our good health to continue to experience, to explore, to adventure, to see things. And I love that that's what's prompted him to take on this monumental bicycle adventure. And I'm looking forward to seeing where this trip will take him next. So, do you want to help the show out? Are you enjoying listening to these episodes each week? Well, chances are you probably know someone who also would enjoy listening to the podcast too. One of the best ways that you can help the podcast grow is actually through word of mouth and recommendations. So if you have some friends that you think enjoy hearing about people taking bike adventures, traveling, slow travel, all of those things, why don't you mention the podcast to them? Share them a link, share it on your socials. It all helps the show to grow, and I really appreciate that. I love the community that's been built up around this podcast, and knowing that more and more people can join it really fills me with joy, because we all get transported each week through our guest stories in that spirit of wanderlust and adventure as well. On that note, until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.